Hi, Lindenwood class. We're back for more Echo Mountain. We're going to start with chapter 47. Here we go. Chapter 47. I sat on the cabin step, lost in thought, until Samuel came up from the root cellar, a basket of potatoes over his arm and a grin on his face. I saw a white spider as big as my hand. It was disgusting. Kind of squishy. You didn't kill it, did you? I pictured the spider smashed onto the root cellar floor like a spent star, dingy and dark. Don't be foolish. Of course I didn't kill it. I just touched it to see how it felt. It was disgusting. He grinned some more. I might want one for a pet. I bet Mother and Esther would love that. No, they wouldn't, Ellie, he said, shaking his little head. Mother's right. You have lost your wits. Do you want me to teach you how to make a potato poultice? I said, to make Daddy's sores better. Samuel made a face. A what? Come inside. I'll show you. Which I did, though I ended up doing most of the work myself while he told me how to do it. As I squeezed off some of the potato juice, he said, Why isn't Daddy awake? I stopped what I was doing. He's tired is all. He needs a lot more sleep before he wakes up again. But he's already been sleeping for a long time. I nodded. I know that, but he'll wake up soon. I set aside the potato. Now we'll collect some witch hazel twigs. Some what? By answer, I took him out again into the yard and across to where the witch hazel grew. The bark makes a good skin cleaner. I yanked off some twigs. Samuel spent some time on one of the bigger branches before he gave up and dedicated himself to a twig as thick as his little finger. But even that was too much for him. It would be easier if these were dead, I said, but they're alive, so they bend a lot before they break. Which made me think of Kate, and my father, and Mother, and Larkin, and his mother. The list was long. Here, I said, let me. But he shrugged me off and used both hands, bending the twig back and forth until he'd sawed through the raw green of it. He held the twig up like a trophy. Do you want some more? No, that's perfect, I said. We'll boil this up and mix some with the potato. Which we did. The result was a goopy mess, but I had learned to have quite a lot of faith in goopy messes. Just lay this onto his sores, I told my mother, holding out the bowl, and cover them up with something. The witch hazel might sting, but it won't be as bad as vinegar. My mother didn't take the bowl. Don't you think you should do this yourself? I thought about how I had managed to squeeze honey into Kate's wound, but had not imagined treating my own father's sores. Won't you? I said in a small voice. She considered me for a long moment, chewing her lip, before she reached for the bowl. Yes, I'll do this part, Ellie. You go on and help Samuel with his lessons. Except that wasn't right. That didn't feel right, or good at all. When she said that, my gut, the spot at the top of my belly just below my heart, swung off kilter. I remembered teaching Samuel to catch the trout, how I had been the one to club it over the head. But he was just small and I wasn't. And if I was to be the one to start something, I would be the one to finish it. So, no, I said slowly, swinging back toward True. I don't mind. I'll do it. I don't want to do my lessons, Samuel said, and I made the potato thing, so I should get to help too. Esther needs someone to read to while we take care of your father, my mother told him. Let that be you. He wasn't entirely convinced, but my mother's face gave him no choice in the matter, so he went with us toward my father's room to fetch Esther. When she heard what we meant to do, she stood up so quickly that her book fell to the floor. Come on, Samuel said, picking it up. You can read to me now. For a long moment she stayed where she was, looking at me and the bowl of potato in my hand, looking at my mother, a fair amount of regret plain on her face, but she didn't say a thing. It was clear that she wanted no part of what we were doing, though I would have thought some messes worth making, even for Esther. Maybe if I could help my father all the way to well again, she would come back to me too, as she had for a little while not so long before. But that would be up to her. When Esther and Samuel had left, my mother turned my father over and used clean rags to cover him everywhere except the sores themselves, so I was looking at a landscape of white cloth and red flesh. All the while he lay still and showed no signs of waking. Nonetheless, I talked to him as I had for months now, hoping he could hear me. I'm sorry if this hurts, I said as I spooned the potato mixture onto the wounds and laid more rags over the poultices. My mother stood out of the way while I worked, holding her own hands, but as soon as I was through she covered my father with a blanket and pulled the rocking chair up close beside him. "I'll stay with him," she said. "You go and finish getting supper ready." She stroked his hair. At the door I turned back to see her lay her head next to his, her whole body shaking. But then Samuel came running, shouting, "Come see! That big dog is at the door, Ellie, and he has a doll in his mouth." Chapter 48. My mother wanted me to wait until morning to go see if Kate was all right. "But that's her doll," I said at the cabin door, Esther and my mother on either side of me. "Captain wouldn't have left her alone at night, and he wouldn't have taken her doll unless something was wrong." "What's an old hag doing with a doll?" Esther said. "I'll bet it's a puppet, for making spells, or cursing someone." I thought about the blessing Larkin had taught me, the one Kate said to him whenever he left her. "Shame on you," I said. But Esther didn't look ashamed. "And why would her dog come to you? You've only known her for a little while. Why wouldn't he have gone to Larkin?" I didn't know the answer to that, but I pictured him there too, trying to help her but needing help himself. I said as much. "Then I'll go with you," my mother said, though she sounded a little uncertain. "You will?" I turned to stare at her. She looked like the same mother I'd had that morning, but something was different, and I thought back to what she'd said about emptiness. Maybe she saw, in the shape of a dog with a doll in his mouth, a chance to do something about that. "I will," she said. "If it's more trouble than the two of them can handle, they'll need both of us. Esther, you'll take care of Samuel and your father while we're gone." She glanced down at her dress. "But let me do something about this first." I didn't know what she'd intended, but then she came back wearing a pair of my father's trousers, cinched with his belt at the waist and rolled into cuffs at the ankle. "You'll have to clean off those poultices in a while," she told Esther, who looked like a child for the first time in years. "I'll help you, Esther," Samuel said. "I'm good with poultices." His face reminded me of when he had helped Mr. Peterson with the thorn in Scotch's hoof. But Esther just looked hard at me and then my mother and back again before turning away toward my father's room. "Now what did I do?" I said softly. "Nothing," my mother replied. "I think she's upset with me this time." "For going to Miss Kate's with me?" She sighed. "For both those things." I had said only one thing, though now I saw it as two. I pulled on my boots while my mother fetched hers. We buttoned up our jackets, mine still damp but warm from hanging by the stove. "Should we take something along?" my mother said. "Me," Samuel said. "I want to go too." "No, Esther needs you to stay here," my mother said, "to help with your father." "We should take some jerky," I replied, "and a lantern. We would need light on the trail and quick fire when we got there. And bread." She put the food in a sack while I fetched a lantern and lit it at the stove. I felt in my pockets for my knife, my flint. "You should wear a cap," I told her, "so the branches on the path don't get caught in your hair." She stared at me. "Is that why you cut yours off?" I nodded. "The trees kept trying to comb it." My mother reached out to touch my hair for a moment, then she put on a cap and gathered her things. Captain was still waiting, but as soon as we joined him, he dropped the doll at my feet and then loped off across the yard toward the path up. It wasn't quite dusk yet, though the woods were full of shadows, and I was glad to have my mother close beside me, better than a knife in my hand. But before we had gone very far, I heard Esther calling, "Wait! Mother, wait!" We stopped. Captain stopped. Up the path Esther ran, panting. "Let me," she said. "Mother, if something happens and you're not back soon, I don't know, I won't know what to do with Daddy and Samuel. Let me go instead." She looked very young standing there. "But we're already on our way," my mother said, and I heard in her voice something just as young, a thread pulling her back toward a time when she was a girl on an adventure, the same thread pulling her forward, and we'll be back before you know it. But Esther was pulling on a similar thread, and she was much closer to the spool than my mother was, the thread less likely to break. "Please," she said, "I'll help Ellie. I promise I will, and I'll look after her." As if I needed her to look after me. The idea was just plain silly, and it made me mad. But I stood still and waited for the two of them to sort themselves out. Captain did likewise, though his whole body yearned to be gone, uphill, to home. My mother looked past Esther toward the cabin. "You left Samuel alone." "I did," Esther said, nodding. "I told him you'd be down soon," which seemed to decide things. My mother sighed, pulled the cap from her head and handed it to Esther, handed her the bag with the bread and jerky. She gave me a long look. "Take care of your sister," she said. And I loved her more than ever. I had wanted her with me, to meet Kate, to look into those blue eyes and realize everything I'd realized, and maybe more. But I wanted Esther to know just as much. As it turned out, I had plenty more to learn, too. Chapter 49. The climb was easy for me, but Esther had a hard time with the pace, the rocky path, the darkness as it deepened, and the way the branches batted at her face as she struggled up the deer trail. To her credit, she didn't say a word, not even when she fell, once, twice. "You can go back if you want." I waited as she struggled to her feet, clapping the dirt off her hands. "Just go on." She was a little short of breath. Her hair had come loose and hung from her cap in soft, fair loops. I stepped to one side so she could go first. "Give me that sack," I said, handing her the lantern, "and go on ahead. I'll be right behind you. When we get to the steep part, don't let go of one tree until you've got a grip on another." "How, when I have to hold the lantern, too?" Which made me impatient, that she would ask me such a thing when the only answer was to manage it, difficult or not. But I said, "I'll help you," and when it came to that, I did. When we arrived at the cabin, Kate wasn't there. "Where is she, boy?" I asked Captain when I opened the door and found her bed empty, but he stayed out in the yard and didn't answer. Esther crept in behind me, swatting at a fly come to taste her lips. "What an awful place," she whispered, and I saw it fresh through her eyes. The narrow bed, one hard chair, a table, the shelves with jars full of oddments and potions and worms, the nubs of spent candles squatting like toadstools all over the place. But then I swung the lantern so she could see the fistful of snowdrops in a mug next to her bed, which meant Larkin, the tiny fawn and the mouse and the squirrel, and those tools which were in their own way beautiful. But it was only when I held the lantern high to cast light on the shelves full of books, the hanging garden, that I saw her face change. "Oh," she said. I laid the little doll on the bed. There was a stain on the blanket. "I wonder if her wound opened up." I bent to sniff the blanket for pus or honey, pulled back at the idea of what that would look like to Esther, then leaned closer, inhaling the scent of Kate's wound. It was chilly in the cabin, and a wind had kicked up to push the cabin door wide and follow us inside. "Maybe she fell," I said. I ducked past Esther and into the yard, pausing at the sight of Kate's clean wash hung to dry, waving and dancing at the edge of the yard. Larkin, he had done her wash and left water for her bath, and I wondered if she had decided not to wait for my help. "This way," I said, following Captain around the side of the cabin toward the shed behind it. We found her lying outside the shed, wrapped in a blanket that was red where it covered her leg. I rushed to gather her up. "Help me!" I yelled when Esther stood back watching. So Esther did help me, though with such a look of distaste that I wanted to slap her. Kate was heavy, despite how thin she was, but we managed to carry her back into the cabin while Captain danced along beside us, whining darkly. She moaned a little as we laid her on the bed and covered her up. "There's firewood in the yard, Esther. Go get some." Which she did, while I ripped pages from the big book on the desk and shredded them on the hearth. I hoped they taught nothing more important than the benefits of fresh air and clean water, which I already knew. When Esther came back, I twisted a whole page into a wick and lit it in the lantern, laying it gently on the hearth. "Careful," I said, as she reached out with a handful of twigs. "You'll smother it. Just one at a time to start. Like this." I laid a single twig across the bricks I'd pushed into place on either side of the flame. It's not like the oven at home, which could handle a heavy hand. In this way I taught my sister how to build a fire on a cold hearth. Before long we had a good blaze going, and I opened the cabin door just a crack so the smoke would rise straight up into the wide mouth of the chimney. Then I fetched a clean nightdress from the wash line and took it inside to warm by the fire. While Esther stood and watched, I went to Kate and pulled the blankets away from her leg. The wound gaped like a terrible red mouth, but it wasn't bleeding much anymore. The bath must have melted the honey, opened the cut. Maybe she fell. Maybe she fainted. "We'll know when she tells us," I said, "but I don't know why she let it get wet in the first place." Captain stood beside the bed and laid his head next to Kate's. "Why did you open the door if you're trying to warm her up?" Esther said. "To increase the draw for the fire," I replied. "The draft, the flow of air." "I don't know what that means." She sounded cranky and subdued at the same time. "When the fire eats the air inside, the smoke comes back down the chimney instead of going up it. My father had taught me that. I wondered why he hadn't taught Esther, but I knew that it was easier to teach a thing to someone who wants to know it. I thought you said she was getting better." "She was, but she's stubborn, and she's used to doing for herself, and she didn't wait for me to help with her bath." I pulled the blanket back over her leg. Then I fetched the deerskin coat from the trunk and laid that over her too. It was so heavy that I knew it would keep her heat in where it belonged and make her feel safe besides. Heat up some jerky in that skillet there, on the wall, I told Esther. Just lay it across the bricks. She did what I said without question, tending the fire and the jerky both. The smell of the venison softening made Captain go toward her and sit nearby. "What an ugly dog," Esther said. "Oh, hush," I said. "You're a beauty, Captain, a beauty," at which Kate stirred. She peered at me in confusion. "Captain came down to fetch me," I told her. "He had your doll in his mouth." She looked at me, blinking, slow to wake. I said, "I don't know why he came for me instead of Larkin." She closed her eyes again. "Larkin's mother isn't so fond of Captain." I pushed Kate's hair away from her face. "How could she not be fond of a dog like that?" "He was my son's dog." She closed her eyes again. "First mine as a puppy, but he took to my son like a bird to the sky, so—" "Shouldn't that make her love Captain even more?" Kate didn't reply. After a while she opened her eyes again and said, "You must be a very strong girl to carry me back in here." "Oh," I said, realizing suddenly that Esther was still standing quietly by the fire where Kate couldn't see her. "My sister came up with me." "And we should be getting back now," Esther said. "Mother will be worried." Kate craned her neck around. "A sister?" Esther came forward a bit, though she still kept her distance. Kate stared at her. "You can come closer, child. I won't bite." After a long moment Esther came to stand next to me by the bed, though she looked like she wanted to be somewhere else altogether. "Ellie, fetch the lantern," Kate said, frowning, which I did, hoisting it so the light fell on Esther's face. "Oh, my," Kate said, her eyes growing wide. She reached for my sister's hand, though Esther clearly did not want to give it. "You look nearly the same," she said. "Older, but the same." And I smiled at what was coming. Then she looked harder at me, at my face, my hair. "Though you have changed quite a lot. You're thinner than you were, taller. Your hair used to be so long." She reached up with her other hand, and I bent lower so she could touch the softness. And Esther said, "I used to call you Rapunzel." And I felt in that touch the big jolly nurse we'd once known, the one who had called me Rapunzel and tended to Esther's earaches. Kate was not big, nor was she jolly, but as I looked into her blue eyes I knew both what she was and what she had once been, which were really the same thing, though they weren't. Here beside me was another soul, both split in two and doubled. She looked at Esther again. "Do you not know me?" Esther shook her head, but then she bent closer, and her own eyes grew big. "Nobody called Ellie Rapunzel except Mrs. Cleary," she said slowly. And it wasn't the lantern that lit my sister's eyes as she sat down on the edge of the bed and said, "But Mrs. Cleary was a big woman. She was a big round woman with rosy cheeks and hair in a braid down her back and blue eyes." She leaned closer. "Like yours, but you can't be her. You can't be." And then Esther was crying, wrapped in the arms of a woman who had wanted nothing at all but to make Esther well when she was sick, to make her stop hurting so much. I felt like a bystander, which made me sad, but I felt joyful too. The Esther I'd once known was right there, close enough to touch, and so was the hag who had once been Mrs. Cleary, and still was. That's the end of chapter 49. We'll pick up again tomorrow. Apologies for my cat, who apparently wants to join in the story time as well and is making lots of noise. I'm going to go let him out of the room, and I will pick up again tomorrow.